Morning. Happy Friday, folks. So we're exploring the theme of grief this month, and I, I'm sharing today about the theme is 5 signs you might be grieving and not even know it. And this is coming up for me right now because I'm imagining sometimes folks might hear the word grief and think, I don't know that that really applies to me, or nothing like catastrophic has happened. I haven't experienced a big loss or a big or death of a loved one. Like there's a common association with grief and kind of the extreme events in life. So you might be, hearing me talk about it this month and be like, but what do I have to grieve? Well, I want to invite you to consider that grief is a part of life that we will all encounter to some degree. And it can have some, what I'm calling some sneaky allies that can help grief hide in plain sight. And often, as we'll get into, masking or containing grief until our system knows that we have the space to let it out, to let it move through. So with some practice and some context, some containment, my invitation for us this month is to start to learn to recognize the presence of grief so that we can address grief at its source, really as a way of participating in the kind of full spectrum of our own emotional capacity, our full spectrum of human experience. So the first thing I want to share, so I have 5 signs, right? The first sign showed up most recently for me, so I'm starting there, and that is irritability. So irritability is this ally that can often be a mask for grief. It was just a week ago, it was like Monday, I think. I woke up feeling so crabby. I was just like completely on the wrong side of the bed. And it took doing like a very elaborate or the full course of my morning routine, walking, yoga, having a meal, my full 40-minute meditation. Finally, in meditation, I could feel myself like kind of dropping down under the irritability, some of that kind of cracking a little bit. And underneath what I felt was sadness. And I just had to let some of the tears move through, kind of let the well of that stuck emotion move through. And, at that time, I mean, in this whole season, I think what I was tuned into, it feels connected to autumn. It's like kind of that, so muchness of the season. And really the longing, how I feel it personally is kind of this longing for my dreams to be manifesting more quickly, and the impatience of the waiting. So there's a lot of fullness, a lot of abundance, but we're also sort of winding down for this season, right? And I'm, feeling some death in to my own expected timeline of things. And that's a death that just a natural byproduct is grief. Like that's how part of that energy moves through. Hey there, thanks for joining. For folks, whenever you're joining, if you want to just say hi and say where you are watching from, where you're joining from. So I just shared the first sign of that you might be grieving, and it's irritability. You have to go back and watch if you want to learn more. The second one is depression. So this one may feel obvious. We kind of have a natural association of depression with sadness, but I want to invite you to consider that there's kind of an overconflation or an oversimplification of depression with grief and sadness. So what I've learned from my own experience is that for me, and I want to hold here that depression is a complex experience with many things that may influence it. So this is just speaking of it in terms of its relationship to grief and from my own experience. So for me, what I've learned is depression is actually, I like to think of them as like the ally that my spirit called in to hold, to contain, to hold back grief that I wasn't ready or able to metabolize at the kind of moment of inception. So it took me a long time, of course, to appreciate it as an ally. Like depression is not a necessarily pleasant experience, but I have come in a way to feel a kind of gratitude for the way that depression actually can form a kind of cushion around me in a softening of the impact of the world as I experience it. That I kind of recognize or appreciate it now as the way my spirit figured out how to survive periods of um, fracture and where the grief would have been too much for me as a little person. So unfortunately, depression doesn't discriminate about what it sort of dampens or holds in or out. At least in my experience, it puts that blanket damper on the whole spectrum of emotional capacity. So, if there's a signal that the grief is going to be too much, the damper goes on and all emotional capacity shrinks. So joy as well as sorrow is becomes inaccessible. So even though we might think that being depressed is obviously feeling grief, what I want to highlight here is that it's actually the opposite. It's the inability to feel both sadness and joy and the full spectrum of emotions. Depression can be a way of numbing what we might be afraid or unequipped to feel fully in that moment, which can include grief. So that's why I call it one of the signs. If there is sort of this layer of numbness or dull capacity of feeling, it may be that actually we haven't quite been able to touch the grief underneath it that depression thinks it is shielding us from. In a similar family, anxiety can be one of the signs that there's grief. Similar to depression, I've come to notice that for me, anxiety can act as a kind of buffer to grief. And similarly, much of our wider emotional capacity. The energetic blueprint of anxiety, however, is different than depression, right? I'm sure you've experienced this as well. Depression has a much heavier earthbound energy. In psychic energy medicine, it's more associated with stuck energy from the past. Whereas anxiety is much more air element driven, as we would say in the Ayurvedic tradition. It's much more air driven. In psychic energy medicine, it's the energy, it's the stuck future energy in our system that causes anxiety. And the experience for me is a kind of hovering above emotions that feel intolerable. Like there's a kind of hum or hovering or a buzzing that keeps me suspended from the emotions like grief that may feel untouchable at the time. So that's number 3, anxiety. Number 4 may be another obvious one to you, but this is going through a difficult change, large or small. So that, again, might be obvious, but and it of course includes the obvious things that would incite grief, like the death of a loved one, like the loss of a job or breakup or sudden tragedies in our communities or world. Of course, those are going to be moments that elicit grief. However, there are also the ongoing chronic changes and challenges that we might not even have time to notice or seem insignificant or they're so pervasive that they've kind of faded into the background. And these also stir grief. These are there's a byproduct of these events that has the same blueprint. And this can be from the daily disappointments, the daily frustrations, the daily highs and lows, to the more chronic stresses of life in pandemic or life under empire, especially if you're Black or brown or poor or queer or disabled, war around the globe, the ecological crisis. Like, all of these have a kind of vibrational hum that we're exposed to in a daily way. Of course, each of us, depending on life circumstances and where we are in the world, will be attuned to different levels of these. But I believe all of these have a kind of low-grade hum, kind of set this humming or buzzing throughout our human existence. And that humming kicks up a lot of emotional debris that we don't have, at least in sort of dominant Western culture. We don't have a lot of good channels to metabolize. So it's arguable that, and part of why I do a lot of the work that I do, is that in our current era, there is a backlog of undigested both normal and extraordinary grief from these diverse frequencies of life that we haven't quite fully metabolized. So number 5 may be a little bit surprising for some. Number 4 was going through difficult change, large or small. Number 5 is going through joyful change, large or small. So this one may seem less intuitive, but even changes that qualify as good are always a death of some kind. Change, and that's kind of the point I'm trying to make here, change of any kind is a death of some kind. And though it may not make sense, it may feel out of context, it may feel kind of disproportionate, grief can show up at joyful moments. And it's been helpful for me to kind of just flag this so that I can, be less surprised, I guess, when it happens. I don't always catch it right away, but, so that we can be, if possible, be a little bit preemptive or a little less surprised when it comes up, even at times that are supposed to be, joyful. So something like the birth of a child can also mean the loss of a kind of independent life or the individuality of the birthing person. The joining of partners who love each other through something like marriage can be clearly what both parties want, right? Can be a celebration, and it can also bring some sadness about the loss of the joys of single life, or however that transition will manifest for folks. The example that came to mind for me was I had a previous partner who is transgender and going through active transition while we were together. And I was, fully on board and supported his transition. I was excited for his new life. We both were, this was both what we all wanted. And we both had to kind of come to terms and make room for ourselves separately as well as together, that there was a death of a version of our partnership that was happening. And both he and I were going through changes, and we had to make room to grieve those changes, again, both separately and together, even though the death of that version of our partnership was necessary. It was life-giving and what we both wanted. So that's my little example of that. So what I'll just highlight here for us is that change of any kind, as I said, can stir up grief. That grief is kind of an essential alchemical element. I've been calling it a byproduct, but I kind of am filling it out more of like, no, it's kind of part of what helps make the transformation thorough and occur in a well distributed way. And in addition to that, we have these other allies, and there's probably others you could name too, who will help us avoid or numb or hover over grief until we have the space or capacity or feel, a relative safety or ease enough to let it move through, or until those, kind of barriers don't work anymore, and then the grief will just find its way through. And I hope for us to not have to wait to that point, although it has had to happen for me at times. But part of the inspiration for the work that I'm working on right now is to make some of the spaces for gentle tending of the everyday deaths, the everyday griefs, as well as the more extreme or longer term or cultural societal griefs that don't get a lot of space to move through. So invitation now is to join our community grief practice that I'm doing through the Sanctuary Northwest, which is happening Saturday, October 15th from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. It's all virtual on Zoom. It's also sliding scale. There's a suggested donation range, but no one would be turned away for lack of funds. This isn't going to be a high intensity, like plunging in and into and like sharing our hearts out kind of practice. It's going to be, it has several sort of waves of warming up and playing in a creative way with grief as an elemental force, grief as a being that we can dance with and communicate with and relate with, practice relating with. So really is appropriate for anyone. And I guess I would say probably anyone who's not in like acute crisis, that would probably, you probably want a more contained container if you're in some more acute crisis. But for anyone feeling kind of the strain, the low grade strain of life in a body in this season, I would love for you to participate. So I'll leave the information in the comments below. And yeah, please sign up and please share with others that you think might benefit from the practice. All right. Blessings to you all this day. Be well.